Alda. Um, I was struck by listening to your panel today, how openly you were talking about immigration. And I think there's a lot of people in America today who are both fearful of it because of their personal life experiences, or fearful of it because of the way they feel like it intrudes on the life they think they know, or the America they think they know, right? And I think that was quite refreshing to have all of you talk about that in really kind of open ways. And like, I know I grew up a few years, I lived in El Paso, and in the 60s, there was no border issue in El Paso. People just went back and forth across the border as if, you know, it was part of the day, right? And I think the University of Texas, El Paso still has that. I think a large portion of their student population are really Mexican residents who come across to try to go to school. So I think that's, we could do a much better job in this country talking about it and making policies that would reflect the real issues that people face. And I think there's been a surge of books around that issue, right? Those things. So I think that was important. And I hope people were trying to create lists and make lists of those things. I thought it was quite important. I put a link in there to Lant Pritchett's work, who's a Harvard economist who's now doing a retirement gig at Oxford. But 6 or so years ago, he wrote a book called Let Their People Come that argues that the economic value of having the borders more open is good for both the global north and what he calls the global south, not just America and Mexico, but the whole world. Mm-hmm. The economists are looking at it and say, we need to figure this out economically because there might be benefits for everyone, especially the poorest of the poor, in figuring out how to have a more global economy. And he makes recommendations that I don't think any of the politicians have paid attention to, says it was published, right? So that might be it. Well, why don't you guys kind of take turns telling us what you heard, what sessions that you wish you had more time with, or just some general ideas about how you kind of think about the day.
You want to start, Margie, or you?
I was really excited to be part of this for a lot of reasons. One, because I'm an English educator. I was an English teacher for a lot of years. And from there, I went on to become a high school librarian. And then I'm also a student in a doctoral program for young adult literature. So this was just like exciting to me from all levels, like everywhere. Like, I just wish I could have been there in person. So I could have, just because I would like to be around. I like to be around people like me who love young adult books and who love teaching and who love books. So this would have been really great. So I hope that maybe next year I can go, if it's live, that I can be there live, because it was an amazing experience for me as a debut author, as a librarian, as a teacher, and as a student. So I want to thank you guys again for having us. There was so much that I learned in these sessions today. Like I said, because of my background in young adult literature, it was just all so perfect to me. And I was so happy to be part of it and just to be able to listen. And a lot of times whenever I go to different like conventions or conferences, I'm usually like the presenter and this. And so this time I was able to just sit and just listen to everybody else, like, that everything that everyone had to offer, and everybody was so smart and knew, like, I was just impressed, and I was happy to be part of it. And then I got to see Dr. Saldana. I was excited because Dr. Saldana was my professor whenever I was an undergrad here at the University of Texas Pan American. And so he's a friend of mine. And then he taught here in the area that I grew up in. And then he's from here where I grew up. And then he's a contributor in my anthology. So I was happy to see him because I haven't seen him in a long time. So it was nice. Thank you.
No, the same for me. I truly enjoyed just being a writer myself. It was interesting to see just the perspectives, of the academics and the librarians and the teachers, how they view the writing. I think I take for granted, and something I remember during the talks is a few months back, I guess, when the COVID shot, the vaccine came out, and when they started talking about her name's Dr. K, what is it? Carrico, she's the one that came up with that technology for the vaccine with the mRNA. And just seeing her background or hearing about her, how when she was a child, she was fascinated. Everybody thought about DNA, right? DNA was it, but she thought about mRNA. It was a messenger RNA and thought that that was important. So eventually, of course, it's very important because it's the one that's carrying that genetic script. So thinking about that later on, I started thinking, okay, what other things are we messengers out here that we're overlooking and taking for granted? And today with this talk, this whole day, I'm like, these are the messengers here. These are the ones that carry these scripts that we write, these stories that we write and carry them to readers, to the students. So this is essential for people to read these books and analyze them. And the way I was just mesmerized by how they broke down text and interpretations. And one, I believe the first one I saw was by Sophie, and she started talking about the windows and the sliding doors. And I thought that was excellent way of portraying that. I'm like, that's what because I just write. I don't really think about what I'm writing, but it's nice for someone to take that text and actually see, I learn a lot from it too, because sometimes I read not interpreting the text. I'm more come from the writing aspect of it, but to see it in a different way, I learned so much today. I was just blown away by all the information. There was another one, I believe it was San Juana, how the award committees, how they very meticulous work. And oh my goodness, it's amazing what they go through, and how many books, there's so many excellent, talented writers out there. I'm sure it's just an overwhelming task to pick that. So to learn the way she viewed it and her process was mind-blowing too. I enjoyed that. And then Paul started breaking down picture books too. And it was, again, I was just fascinated. That Pancho Rabbit book, the way it was just really, I had never thought about it that way. And I, read that book so many times, but to see it the way he showed it, it was great. So I'm glad to be here. I'm honored, that I gave the talk, and not only that, but that I've learned so much more from everybody's perspective.
To highlight what you just said, Alda just went down like 3 of the children's lit sessions, which I was in and out of sometimes, and they were all fabulous. So we hope you don't discount and leave us to children's, Alda, because the YA side was banging too. But that was they were really.
That was my fault, because I told Alda, she goes, "What do you want to do?" I said, "I want to do YA. Like, I need to go to all the YA sessions." So
it was great.
Like, okay, I'll go to the children's. I didn't think about it like that. She could have learned something.
No, it was wonderful. I loved it. Yeah, no, it was amazing. So, and even the keynote speakers in the morning with Mitali, the code switching. Oh my goodness, that hit close to home for me, because that's how I grew up too, trying to assimilate into a new culture. And yeah, I felt it was the same way. There was a written code that I had to break and find out how to adapt to that world and to make it work better for me, my family, and opportunities and whatnot. So that was wonderful too.
And like she was saying how she was like she had never read books. And that's the way I read books, I guess, because I come from an English background. Everything I read it. And sometimes I try not to. Sometimes like I need to read just for pleasure and enjoyment. But my brain doesn't do that. Like I start analyzing and this and that. And where can this go? And what can I tell my teachers about this? Like it's just, my mind just goes crazy because I guess I was trained that way. I don't know, but that's just the way I read. Sometimes I'm like, just read for fun, Margie, read for fun. And my brain doesn't do fun. It has to like, okay, this needs to go in this, I can show this to this teacher to do in this, particular unit that she always talks about. And then I'm really big on diverse literature. That's like my passion. So young adult literature, and then diverse literature. And then I just and then I go down the rabbit hole, and I just can't, I go crazy with books, trying to figure out where this book can fit in the world. And
yeah, and it makes me wonder too, because when I grew up, like I said, I was a reluctant reader, and it makes me wonder now that I see the summit, how were summits 20, 30 years ago? Were they really small? Was it almost non-existent. You know, what was the world like then? Because I didn't see so many books as I see now, that I'm glad these generations have access to these new authors, new voices. And
Well,
so it makes me wonder.
that's a really good question. And if Jeff Kaplan is here, we might ask him to weigh in on that. But when I first started trying to do something like this at LSU and called it a summit on the research and teaching of young adult literature through 2010, from the 60s, was really advocating and cheerleading. There were people that were critically analyzing it, but not the bulk of people. So I began to see this, and I didn't do this alone. Even in the early days, I talked with Craig Hill, who's been mentioned in a couple of sessions, who's teaching his own summer seminar through Friday. You'll probably join us on Saturday. But so Jeff, if you're still listening, you might weigh in on how many conversations were around critically about young adult literature.
The answer to that question, Steve, is not many. No, not many at all. All you have to do is, I'm trying to get myself back on video here. The only thing you have to do is really look at ProQuest and look at the number of doctoral dissertations that I'm done on young adult literature, and you'll find very few. And then in recent years, that number has grown increasingly more. But it's not really considered for a long time a field of sophistication. It was considered a field of pleasure. And not until recently that people have taken a critical look at it. I mean, I don't remember any time anyone getting up and saying, I don't like this young adult book. You know, I think Steve was absolutely right that it was really began as a fan base, as rightly so.
Yeah.
Rightly so. And like anything else, it begins with fans, and then after a while, you take a closer look at it.
So you're basically the trailblazers here.
Well, you know, I mean, I just believe, as many other people do, that books save lives, and that when kids find a book that speaks to them directly, it changes who they are and changes who they are forever. You know, you've had relatives, I've had relatives that have done things that were not considered by any stretch of the imagination wonderful. But once they settle down and find something that's of interest to them, they usually find a book connected to that, and it changes their life.
So that kind of answers your question, although we think we're on the cutting edge of this. And for the last 4 years, many of the people that are still here have done a lot of critical thinking about young adult literature. Michelle Falter and Sarah and Gretchen and other people are still here. But so what other ideas you heard? And I think, you know, as we have the discussion, it's perfectly fine if other people say, hey, I heard something too. You can add into this as well, right?
I just want to add one other thing, is that I didn't realize that until the internet became of age, and I'm sure Steve had this revelation as well, that you would look up a topic and all of a sudden your name would pop up. You know, it's like, wait a minute, nobody else wrote about this. You know, no one else did. And you realize that, oh, it's a very small community, because outside of, you know, the American Library Association or YALSA and NCT and International Literary Association, there were very few people talking about it. You know, I mean, you wouldn't go to an English department and find a subject on young adult literature. And yet it always amazed me, because, you know, you just have to open the New York Times, and if you're a young adult author, if you're very conventional in the sense that your topic matter is conventional, that book is on the bestseller list for weeks on end. I mean, you know, Jeff Kinney and you know,
yeah,
Harry Potter. I mean, just weeks on end.
So Alda and Margie, what other insights do you want to add? And I love your glasses.
Oh, thank you. They're like, everybody thinks sometimes, like I wear them at school. They don't ask me anymore, but when I first started wearing my glasses, they're real. Like, they have they're prescription lenses. Because my eyes, I'm getting old, and my eyes are getting old. And I was like, if I'm going to have to do this glasses thing, I'm going to have cute glasses all the time. So these are children's glasses, but they fit. They're for little girls. But another thing that I was really like impressed with was the knowledge of all of the presenters. Like, I've done presentations at different library conferences here in Texas and different English teacher conferences. And I was just watching these presenters, like, and then taking notes, like, okay, she did this and she's talking about this, because like, I want to be able to make my presentations, and if I get asked to do stuff again, just as interesting. And I was like, you didn't get bored. And that's always my biggest thing. Whenever you do presentations, is for people not to get bored with your 45 minutes, because that's a long time to keep people engaged. So I wasn't bored during anybody's presentations today. And that was really fun for me.
Something that I liked was just the title, right? Amplifying Joy, especially after what we've been through. And yeah, that's a perfect name. And also, Dr. Bigmore, the way you opened up about talking about Dick Robinson and the way he was just very approachable and very willing to find out if everything was going okay, if you're doing okay, kind of a mentor like, which I think in times like this is something we need. And so I reflected a lot on that when you mentioned it. And I just got this book yesterday. I ordered in the mail. I don't know if y'all heard of it. It's called Manners Will Take You Where Brains and Money Won't. And I read the first 10 pages and I was hooked. Honestly, I didn't want to stop reading, but I have a writing deadline. So, but this is just fabulous book. And it's old school stuff like you said, that Dick Robinson, just approachable and trying to help others. So that's the way I saw this community too. And I'm just grateful that I was able to experience that and witness that, about how, like y'all both said, that it's so close knit and small, yet very supportive. And that's, I think, what we all need, the writers and also the readers, that link, that strong link that's going to pass that information on. So yeah, it was very uplifting to hear you talk this morning. I was crying too. I was glad the video was out because I was crying. But so
well, I'm not embarrassed to cry anymore. But if I'm going to do it, I'm going to bring some people along with me if I can.
Well, the one thing that Dick Robinson and Steve have in common is to develop a sense of community. I mean, every day I wake up and I'm just so grateful we have the internet, because if my mother were in this age, I mean, she was, but she passed recently. But if she were a kid during the age of the internet, she would go crazy, because books and authors, she loved to read and she would go to the library all the time. But an author to her was someone like Santa Claus. You would never meet the author. They lived way beyond anybody could possibly reach. And if you actually met an author, it was like meeting God on earth. But with the internet and with communities like this, the author and the publisher and the agents all become one. And it just creates a wonderful community. You realize that authors are people like you, and they have ordinary jobs, and they write, and they get, and it's just amazing. That's what these conferences do. They break down those barriers.
Yeah, I think it's motivating too, because Margie runs a festival down in the Valley, and I just launched a book fair last month, which I don't know what I was thinking doing that in launch year. It's just, I lost my mind or something happened, but Margie was there. So she was one of my invited authors. So thank goodness, she showed up there, because it helped. But, and this inspires me when I see summits like this. It does inspire me, the close-knit community, and how writers and readers and academics and everybody, teachers, librarians, all support each other, very tight knit, because we have that common purpose. We want to get these books to the hands, of kids, and be able to create that strength, especially right now, like with the whole amplifying joy. So I really appreciated that.
Yeah, and that's the reason we have conferences. Yeah.
Okay. I'm sorry.
No, that's the reason we have conferences. You break down those barriers, and you will develop a community of one. I still remember to this day my major advisor, tapping me on the shoulder and said, "Jeff, I'd like you to meet somebody." And I turned around and he said, "I'd like you to meet Lois Lowry." And I was like, "What, Lois Lowry?" Because Steve and I know, as you well know, that there are authors who come and go and do wonderful jobs, and they're great reads, but there are very few authors that'll stand the test of time. That years from now, people are reading their books, and that's one. Like Laurie Holtz Anderson, that's another. Chris Crutcher, that's another. And to meet these people, it's like meeting somebody immortal. They'll be talking about them long after we're past pushing up daisies. So,
Margarita, what were you going to say? It's your turn.
I was just when Lois Lowry became my friend on Facebook, I was like, I finally arrived. Lois Lowry is my Facebook friend. I would read The Giver with my kids every year. That was So yes, I
Right.
could never even imagine meeting her in
And
person.
that only made possible by Facebook. It's only
Yeah.
made possible by Facebook. I mean, if we were living in a different age, you'd be writing a letter, putting it in an envelope, and hoping she'd read it. So that's absolutely amazing. My great story about Facebook is I taught for many years in Ocala, Florida, which is a wonderful place to be, but a small town. And my best friend taught Hebrew school, and she had in her class a kid named Dustin Moskowitz. And Dustin Moskowitz, for lack of a better term, was the roommate of Mark Zuckerberg. Together, they created Facebook. And one day she approached him and said, I'm thinking of leaving Harvard and starting a company. And he said, why? Well, we're starting this thing called Facebook. Do you think it's a good idea if I leave Harvard? She said, well, you'll have to do what you want to do. Well, it turned out to be a good idea. And the rest is history. So you never know. The world is just so small and interconnected.
When I met Judy Blume, Judy Blume was one of my favorite writers as a little girl. 7 years old, Judy Blume, right? And I was 35 when I met Judy Blume. And I remember crying like a baby and then I felt dumb because you're crying in front of this woman and she's just looking at you and like, okay, she probably sees this every day. Everybody who comes to her probably cries on her shoulder because you tell her, I've loved you since I was 7 years old, and so she tells you, I remember she told me, she goes, I never get, thank you. And I never get tired of hearing that, she goes, you think you would, but you don't. She probably does, but I know, like, when you meet, I've never met S.E. Hinton from The Outsiders. If I would, then I would go peacefully. After I meet S.E. Hinton, then I'm complete. I'm waiting for that day.
Yeah, well, Steve and I can tell you stories about both. My story about Judy Blume was at the Boston conference, which I was the president of, and Jennifer Bueller, you probably know, was going to introduce her. And the reason she was going to introduce her is because Joan K. Will came to me, my good friend from graduate school, and she said, for your conference, I'm going to get you Judy Blume. I said, yeah, right. No, I'm going to get it. I said, all right, Joan, you do that. And next thing you know, she calls me up and says, I'm getting Judy Blume. I said, how'd you do that? I said, I don't know. She's coming, but she's not going to talk. I said, okay, fine. Because they were going to give her an award. Steve probably remembers this. And then Jennifer Bueller was the person going to give her the award. And Jennifer got up and wrote this beautiful, beautiful speech about the very same thing you said, Margie Read. The very same thing that when she was a kid, she read her book under the covers with a flashlight and loved every single word because they're related to her on a very human level. And I looked up and she was crying. Judy Blume was crying. And Terry Lassane was sitting next to her, was crying as well because it was so well written. So not only Judy Blume got up and accepted the award, but she spoke. So your reaction is just as honest and beautiful as she. Yeah. Yeah. And the other thing with S.E. Hinton came to Allen one year, and the most non-presuming person you ever want to meet. Actually, you would never pick her out in a million years. So this is the person that changed the face of young adult literature. There's not a kid in the world that reads that book, no matter how dated the references are, and they changed their lives. And she is just as surprised as anyone else as people are still reading that book. She said, look, I read this book. I wrote this book. I don't understand what happened, but it took off. So
this is one of the great things. You can see that Jeff is an archive of experiences with young adult literature all the time. But this was one of the things that intrigued me about this when I first became active in Allen and NCTE. I loved these connections, but I could see so often that the authors were ushered in and ushered out. And there weren't the chance to have the cross conversations of experience. And the first time I put together one of these at LSU, I'm a big fan of Matt De La Pena, and Matt's a good guy. And he said, sure, I'll come. And after, he hadn't even given his keynote yet. He'd heard a couple of sessions and been to some concurrent sessions. And he pulled me aside and said, I never knew this happened. I said, what? He said, I never knew people talked about my book like it was literature.
Yeah.
He said, I just come in and give a speech and walk out. He says, this has changed how I think about the audience I'm talking to.
Right.
And he was, and so I thought, as hard as this has been to get it off the ground at LSU, I think the first year, Jim Blassingame can tell you, I think we had 65, 68 people there. And it was very small. It was wonderful. But, we had Matt, Chris Crutcher, Chris Crow came, Kimberly Willis Holt came the first year, and we had a local author. But it was wonderful, but it was hard work for 65 people.
Right.
But you have a conversation with Matt, you think, okay, maybe having a time for authors and academics and teachers and graduate students to have lunch together is worth the nuts and bolts.
It is, because it inspires you to find your own voice. You know, you realize that Matt is just like an ordinary guy, and you know he has great talent. So if he can do it, I can do it. The connections you make when you attend conferences, either virtually or in person to person, are just and go on forever. I remember Steve has gone to author dinners from publishers, and you know, the thrill is that I went to an author dinner once in Knoxville, no, Nashville. It was Nashville. And sitting next to me was John Green before he was John Green. And I turned to him, I said, "Who are you?" He said, "I'm John Green and I write books." I said, "Okay." And the next thing I know, he had like 5 on the New York Times bestseller list. I said, "Well, you can't be." Or Jason Reynolds. Jason Reynolds, I met in Washington, D.C. My wife and I went to a publisher's dinner, and this guy sat down who was the most intriguing individual I ever met, both to look at and talk to. And I said, "Who are you?" And he said, "I'm Jason Reynolds and I write books." And that was before anybody knew Jason Reynolds. And the next thing I knew, I said to my wife, Renee, "Guess who's hosting this and who's hosting that?" And it was Jason Reynolds. So to be there at the beginning is just a thrill. Absolutely.
And that's what we're looking for you guys as debut authors, right?
Right. I mean, you never know.
I can remember that Jacqueline Woodson came the second year, and the only reason she came is because Matt De La Peña told me, "Well, she's my neighbor and I can talk to her."
That's right. Yeah.
And I said, "Would you talk to her?" And and she says, "I'm only taking your phone call because Matt De La Peña said to take your phone call."
Right.
And I said, "This is what we hope to do, and this is what we'd like you to do." And she says, "I'll come if I'm not the token Black writer." I said,
Right.
"Oh."
Right.
I said, "The whole week is going to be African-American authors." And that was the year we brought Jacqueline, and we brought Kwame Alexander and Sharon Draper and Sharon Flake. And we brought Co Booth, and it was a wonderful week. You know, we had the authors there overlap 2 days. So they reached there 2 days and overlap. But Jacqueline just told me straight out, "This is what I'll do. This is what I won't do. This is, you know, this is how I see the world. This is how you better shape it." And I appreciated that. And the question I asked her, I says, "Who should I be reading that I'm not reading?" And she said, Varian Johnson and Jason Reynolds, who I hadn't read any of them, right? I think they both had one book out. Jason might have had the second one out. And so I immediately went and bought all the books I could find by both of them. And she's exactly right. I mean, she's in the field. It's a good reason she was the ambassador, right, of this. So it's good. Oh, it's 4:00. So are we going to close this one and open the next one, or just leave this open, Sarah? What do we do?